The vaccines under the declared state of emergency were characterized in the federal contracts with the vaccine manufacturers as what are called medical countermeasures. Countermeasures is not a medical or a public health term. It's a term that comes out of the military and intelligence community.
Of
right?
course.
And characterizing these as medical countermeasures basically removes a lot of the safety and good manufacturing protocols that would otherwise apply to pharmaceutical products. This is aside from the emergency use authorization.
This is literally
issue
a biosecurity
at the FDA. No, it literally is. So my colleague at the Brownstone Institute has basically done the research to show that in the federal org chart of who is actually quarterbacking and running the show during COVID, you would think Health and Human Services would be quarterbacking our response because that's the department that contains our public health agencies, the NIH, the CDC, the FDA. But no, the Health and Human Services department was answering to guess which department was quarterbacking the whole COVID response. Turns out it was the Department of Defense. So this was a really militarized response to COVID. So what do I mean by biomedical security state in the title of my book, subtitle of my book? It's the welding together of three things that used to be distinct. Number one is an increasingly militarized public health apparatus. Number two is novel technologies of surveillance and control. We could talk more about that later. And the third is these two things are backed up by the police powers of the state. Again, that whole apparatus is still in place. All the legal mechanisms that permitted it are still in place, just waiting for the next declared emergency or crisis to be rolled out again. So the DoD was running our response. And regardless of whether this was a virus created in a lab, I think we definitely have a preponderance of evidence and moving toward beyond reasonable doubt level of evidence that COVID was created at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, probably with help and funding from the United States, from the National Institute of Health, funneled through this outfit called EcoHealth Alliance. But even if it wasn't, even if it was naturally occurring, our government treated COVID as though it was a bioweapon. That's what our response indicated. So make of that what you will. Just allowing it to fade away without a clear retrospective, without a clear post-mortem on the pandemic and a real reckoning with everything that went wrong is a disastrous way forward. And the reason is the whole infrastructure, even though many of these specific policies that I've mentioned, lockdown, school closures, vaccine mandates, mask mandates, so on and so forth. Many of these specific policies have been rolled back. Most of them have been rolled back in most places. The whole infrastructure that made all of that possible, what I call in my book, The New Abnormal, the biosecurity apparatus, that is all still in place, ready and waiting for the next declared public health emergency. So people have proposed lockdowns, for example, for climate change. That proposal was floated in the earliest weeks of the COVID lockdowns back in March, April of 2020.
Wow.
We already saw academics with serious titles. I was going to say serious academics. We saw politicians in power proposing rolling or periodic lockdowns to deal with the climate crisis. And we've seen, even prior to COVID, many issues in the public square being redefined as public health issues because health and safety has proven such a powerful fulcrum or lever to push things through, especially under declared state of emergency, that otherwise would not be accepted under ordinary circumstances. So, for example, if you look at the headlines, just bracket for a moment your views on climate change, but just look at how it's been characterized in the last 5-6 years, even before COVID. It's moved from being framed primarily as an environmental issue or an ecological issue to being framed always in terms of harms to population health and harms to human health. Racism was declared a public health crisis. Yeah. You'll remember during the lockdowns, 1,200
so that people were allowed to burn down CVS's.
Exactly. Just so. Yeah, just so. So you had this letter signed by 1,200, so-called public health experts with fancy titles saying that in the, intersectional hierarchy of public health crises and emergencies, racism stood higher than COVID for those people that were protesting after the George Floyd issue. So what we saw during COVID was a tendency to want to jump from one declared emergency to the next. So we've seen efforts already to create the next public health crisis, whether it was the monkeypox scare or the triple-demic, where we were going to have COVID and RSV and influenza. It was going to be a really bad winter, none of which happened, right? But this grasping for something for which emergency powers can be declared. Why has the state of emergency lasted so long? And by the way, Biden has said it's going to be over, but it's still not over. I think May 11th was the day. So as of today, as of our recording, we're still operating under a federal state of emergency, in which the president gains 128 additional extra constitutional powers that he wouldn't otherwise have. He can unilaterally declare a state of emergency. Actually, he endorses the state of emergency. The person who declares the state of emergency is the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, a man named Javier Becerra, former Attorney General of my home state,
no friend of yours,
California. Right, exactly. A lawyer with no public health training and no public health experience. And so the executive branch declares the public health emergency, gains additional powers, decides when that emergency is over. In other words, when we who gain those powers are going to relinquish those powers also include more access to the purse strings, which are usually controlled by Congress. Right. But emergency, money is available basically for the executive branch and Biden to spend during a state of emergency. So this is a very bad setup vis-a-vis the Constitution. It essentially brackets the Constitution for an extended period of time, in this case, an indefinite potential period of time. So one of the things I propose at the end of the book in my policy chapter is that we need some sort of checks and balances on the declared state of emergency. This happens at the state level too, by the way, with governors doing the same thing. So the legislature either has to ratify it a couple of weeks in and vote to renew it on a periodic basis. They're not the ones gaining additional powers, and they should put a check on those powers. Or we need to decide and define in law what does and does not constitute an emergency, some sort of threshold requirements that would allow for judicial review. So, someone whose business got shut down could file a suit saying they're shutting down my business under this declared state of emergency, or my kids are being harmed because they can't go to school under this declared state of emergency. And we're no longer meeting the criteria for the emergency. And then the courts could take a look at that and say, yeah, this has to end.